scarp. All right, that's good. You got him now.
Yeah, sure.
Look at here, he's coming from deep water.
For more than 50 years, the Louisiana swamp has shaped Troy Landry's life. It was his teacher, his livelihood, and the proving ground where he faced danger with confidence, earned through decades of experience. The Bayou was a place he understood, trusted, and called home. But on one quiet, overcast morning, that trust is shaken. Deep in the still waters, Troy encounters something no amount of skill or tradition could prepare him for. What he sees challenges everything he believed about the swamp and forces him to confront a truth far more dangerous than any alligator. From that moment forward, nothing about his world remains the same. The quiet of the swamp. Troy Landry's alarm rang at 4:30 in the morning, just as it had almost every day of alligator season for the last 40 years. He climbed from bed in the darkness of his home in Pierre Part, Louisiana, moving through his pre-hunt routine guided by muscle memory earned through decades of repetition. Coffee, a quick look at the weather, preparing his gear. These simple rituals marked the start of another day, chasing the ancient reptiles that had supported his family for generations. Yet from the instant he stepped outside, something felt off. The air was thick and unmoving, oppressive in a way that had nothing to do with Louisiana's infamous humidity. Troy stopped on the porch and listened, using senses sharpened by a lifetime in the swamp. The bayou spoke its own language, a layered symphony of frogs, shifting bird calls as night gave way to morning, fish breaking the surface, and the distant bellows of alligators claiming territory. Those sounds were as familiar to him as his own pulse. This morning, there was nothing, only silence. A chill crept over Troy despite the warmth. In all his years on these waters, he had never known the swamp to be this quiet. Even during harsh cold snaps, when wildlife slowed and hid, there was always noise, always movement. This kind of absence felt deeply wrong, like the land itself was holding its breath. He loaded the boat anyway, brushing off the feeling as superstition, telling himself there had to be a simple reason. Maybe an approaching storm was altering animal behavior. Maybe it was just a strange morning that would correct itself once the sun climbed higher. Still, his hands hesitated, movements slower than usual as he checked and rechecked gear he already knew was ready, putting off the moment he would push into those eerily still waters. When his son Jacob arrived to join him, Troy saw his own unease mirrored in the younger man's expression. "You feel it too?" Troy asked softly. Jacob nodded. "Swamp's too quiet." "Ain't right." As dawn broke, they eased into the bayou, the motor's hum the only sound cutting through the silence. The water was dark as coffee beneath the overcast sky, cypress trees standing like watchful guards over secrets they refused to share. Troy guided the boat toward his usual hunting grounds, where lines had been set the day before, his chest tight with an anxiety he couldn't explain. At the first marker, Troy's breath snagged. The water around the lines was wrong, stained and unsettling, turning his stomach. Among the cypress knees and hanging Spanish moss floated devastation that made 40 years of swamp knowledge feel suddenly useless. Troy killed the engine, and in the crushing silence that followed, he could only stare at what the bayou had shown them. Jacob spoke in a near whisper. "Dad, what happened here?" Troy had no answer, his throat closed around words that would not come. He had seen death in the swamp countless times, a natural part of an unforgiving ecosystem. But this was different. This was wrong on a scale his mind struggled to comprehend. The discovery stretched before them, undeniable and heartbreaking. And Troy Landry, the man who had faced 1,000-pound alligators with a smile, who had endured hurricanes, floods, and economic collapse, felt something inside him fracture. He had set out for a routine hunt, just another morning like so many before. Instead, he found something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Something that questioned everything he believed about the world he depended on. The swamp had always been honest with Troy, giving and taking in equal measure, teaching him lessons in survival and respect. But this morning, it was teaching him something he desperately not wanted to learn. that even the wildest places, even the most resilient ecosystems, had breaking points, and they'd just found one. A life bound to the bayou. Troy remained frozen in the boat, unable to pull his gaze away from the devastation spread out before him. Dozens of dead fish drifted belly up across the surface, their silver scales flashing dully in the thin morning light. But it wasn't only fish. Turtles floated lifelessly among the debris, their shells rocking gently with the current. Water birds lay tangled along the shoreline vegetation, wings splayed wide in what looked like final, desperate attempts to escape. And worst of all were the 3 young alligators, juveniles no more than 4 or 5 feet long, drifting among the destruction, their eyes clouded and their once powerful bodies rendered helpless by whatever toxic force had invaded this stretch of bayou. "This ain't natural," Jacob said, his voice trembling despite his effort to steady it. "Dad, this is a kill-off. Something contaminated the water." Troy knew his son was right. Accepting it, though, meant admitting that the swamp he had trusted without question, the waters that had supported his family for generations, had been violated in a way far beyond the ordinary balance of nature. This wasn't a gator taking a nutria, or a heron spearing a fish, or even a hurricane reshaping the land. This was poison. This was destruction caused by human hands, on a scale that made his chest ache with every breath. Troy had been born into swamp life in 1960, raised by a father who learned from his father before him, carrying on a legacy stretching back through time. The Landry family had always lived as part of the bayou's ecosystem, harvesting what they needed but respecting the balance, knowing their survival depended on the health of the swamp. Troy passed those same lessons on to his own children, teaching them that the bayou would always provide if you didn't take too much, if you honored what the water gave. Now, surrounded by floating death, Troy felt the crushing weight of every compromise he had witnessed over the decades, every warning sign he had quietly dismissed, every change he told himself was temporary or manageable. Deep down, he knew the truth. The swamp had been slowly dying for years, and he had been too focused on hunting, on running his business, on keeping tradition alive, to let himself truly see it. He remembered the bayou of his childhood, when the water was clear enough to spot fish swimming 6 feet below the surface, when alligator numbers were so strong they seemed endless, when the plant life was so thick and vibrant, the swamp felt like an impenetrable stronghold of nature. That world had been fading little by little, replaced by something weakened and scarred. The oil and gas industry had cut canals through the wetlands, disrupting natural water flow and allowing salt water to intrude and kill freshwater vegetation. At the time, those canals looked like progress, bringing jobs and money to struggling communities. Troy himself had worked on some of those projects when he was younger, before alligator hunting became profitable enough to support him full-time. He told himself the swamp was tough, that it would adapt, that the economic gain was worth the environmental loss. Standing here now, staring at poisoned water and lifeless animals, that justification tasted like ash. There had been other signs too, signs he had seen but refused to fully confront. Fish species that slowly vanished from areas where they were once common. Places that had once burst with life, growing unnaturally quiet. Algae blooms becoming more frequent, sucking oxygen from the water and creating dead zones. Storm surges from hurricanes pushing farther inland, as marsh grass and cypress stands thinned year after year. Climate change only hastened the damage. Rising sea levels drowned protective marshlands and nursery habitats for countless species. Weather patterns grew harsher, with longer droughts followed by heavier floods, changes the ecosystem couldn't adapt to fast enough. Troy had seen the maps, heard the experts, read predictions about Louisiana losing land at catastrophic rates. But predictions felt distant. This floating graveyard of poisoned wildlife was real, immediate, and horrifying. He thought about his grandchildren, about whether there would even be a swamp left for them someday. The idea tightened painfully in his chest. The Landry legacy had never been just about hunting skill or business success. It was about belonging to this place, living by its rhythms, understanding yourself as one thread in the web of Bayou life. What happened to that identity when the Bayou itself was dying? "We need to report this," Jacob said, raising his phone to document what they were seeing. "Wildlife and Fisheries needs to know. Someone's responsible." Troy nodded slowly, though part of him wondered how much reporting would really change. He'd seen violations reported before, investigations stall or fade away. Companies pay fines that barely dented their profits before carrying on as usual. Agencies meant to protect the swamp were underfunded, stretched thin, and overwhelmed by the scale of the damage. He started the motor and eased the boat forward, steering carefully through the affected area to see how far the contamination spread. With every passing minute, the truth grew harder to ignore. This wasn't a small, isolated patch. It was a wide stretch of bayou, possibly miles of water, all marked by the same toxic signature. His mind raced through possibilities. An industrial spill from a plant upriver, agricultural runoff filled with pesticides, illegal dumping by someone who believed the swamp was remote enough to hide their actions. Or maybe it was something more gradual and insidious, the accumulated impact of decades of minor violations and sanctioned pollution finally pushing the ecosystem past its limit. As they rounded a bend, Troy saw something that made his grip tighten on the wheel. One of his tagged alligators, a mature female he had followed for 3 seasons, floated dead near the bank. He had deliberately left her alone because she was a proven breeder. He had named her Josephine, after his grandmother, for her stubborn will to survive that reminded him of the Landry matriarch. Seeing Josephine like this felt personal, cutting deeper than the wider tragedy. She had survived hurricanes, droughts, territorial fights, and 3 seasons when Troy could have legally harvested her but chose not to, wanting her genetics in the population. She had raised multiple clutches, playing a role in the species' recovery from near extinction decades earlier. Now she was gone, killed not by age or predation, but by human negligence or greed. Troy shut off the engine and let the boat drift. The swamp's silence pressed down on him, heavy with loss and accusation. His entire life had been built on taking from these waters. Alligators, fish, crawfish, whatever the bayou offered. He always believed it was sustainable, that he was part of nature's order, no different from a heron hunting fish or a gator hunting nutria. But staring at Josephine's body and the devastation around him, Troy could no longer deny it. His life was tied to the same forces destroying the swamp. The economic system that made his livelihood possible also fueled the industries poisoning the water. The mindset that normalized using natural resources justified both his hunting and the unchecked extraction harming the bayou. He wasn't only a victim of what had happened here, he was complicit in the way of thinking that made it possible. The thought made him feel sick. The burden of tradition. By the time Troy and Jacob made it back to the dock, word was already moving through the tight-knit community of Pierre Part. News always traveled fast in the bayou, especially when it was bad, and other hunters had begun reporting similar discoveries in nearby waterways. What Troy had found wasn't isolated. It was spreading, touching multiple hunting areas and threatening livelihoods that were already hanging by a thread. Troy's wife, Bernita, met them at the house. Worry etched deep into her face. She had spent the entire morning answering calls from other hunting families, local officials, and even reporters who had somehow learned about the situation almost immediately. "Everyone's asking what you think we should do," she told Troy quietly. "They're looking to you for answers." That expectation settled heavily on Troy's shoulders, almost like something he could physically feel. Through the television show, he had become a voice for swamp culture, a familiar face representing a way of life to millions who had never stepped foot in the Louisiana wetlands. People expected leadership from him, reassurance, that trademarked confidence and optimism. But right now, he had neither comfort nor solutions to offer. Jacob, Chase, and Brandon gathered around the kitchen table with several members of their hunting crew. The mood was tense, the usual joking replaced with anxious silence and grim expressions. These men depended on the swamp to survive, and what Troy had seen threatened all of them. "How bad is it?" Chase asked, though his father's expression already gave him the answer. Troy explained what he had found, his voice tired and hollow. As he spoke, he watched the reactions move through the room. Shock turned to anger. Anger bled into fear. Fear settled into something heavier, almost resigned. These were men who had endured hurricanes, financial setbacks, and years of uncertainty. But this felt different. It felt like the ground beneath their lives was splitting apart. "We need to find out who did this," Brandon said, his voice tight with fury. "Somebody poisoned our water, killed our gators, destroyed our grounds. That's criminal. They should pay." Troy felt the same anger burning inside him, but he also knew it wouldn't be that simple. "Could be any number of things," he said slowly. "An industrial plant upriver, farm runoff, illegal dumping, or decades of trash and pollution finally catching up to us. Finding one person to blame might not even be possible." "So we just accept it?" Jacob shot back, frustration sharp in his voice. "We let them wipe out everything our family built and do nothing?" "I didn't say we do nothing," Troy replied, though he wasn't sure what action even looked like. "I'm saying we have to be realistic. This isn't one bad actor we can chase down. This is a system that's treated the swamp like a dumping ground for years. And that system has money, lawyers, and political power. We don't." The words sounded like surrender, and Troy hated hearing them come from his own mouth. His reputation was built on never backing down, on tackling every challenge head-on. But how do you fight something as vast as environmental destruction? How do you wrestle polluted water or challenge broken regulations? Bernita finally spoke. "What about the show?" she said. "You've got a platform. People listen. Maybe it's time to use that voice for more than just entertainment." Troy thought about it. The show had brought security and recognition, turning the Landry name into something widely known. But it had also simplified reality, turning swamp life into adventure and tradition, not complexity and consequence. It celebrated the hunt and the bond between father and son, not pollution or dying ecosystems. "People tune in because it's fun," Troy said. "They don't want to hear about contaminated water or whether what we're doing can last. We start talking about that, we might lose the audience that keeps us afloat." "Then maybe we lose them," Jacob said, his intensity surprising. "Maybe telling the truth matters more. What's the point of having a voice if we're too scared to use it?" The challenge stung because Troy recognized the idealism he once had. Jacob still believed speaking out could make a difference. Troy wanted to believe that too, but years of compromise had worn that faith down. Chase voiced another fear everyone was carrying. "What happens to the season? If the gators are poisoned, can we even hunt? And if we can't, how do we survive?" Alligator season only lasted 30 days, but it supported families for the entire year. Losing it, even partially, could be devastating. "Wildlife and fisheries will decide," Troy said. "They'll test the water and animals. They might close areas. They might shut the whole region down." "And how long does that take?" Brandon asked bitterly. "By the time they finish, the season will be gone." No one had an answer. The conversation dragged on for hours, cycling through anger, fear, frustration, and grief. Then Troy's youngest grandson wandered in, asking when Grandpa would take him gator hunting like he promised. The question hit hard. Troy looked at the 7-year-old boy, full of excitement, and felt something inside him crack. "Soon, buddy," he said softly. But even as he said it, he wondered if it was a promise he couldn't keep. Later, alone on the porch, Troy stared out at the water as the sun set. Bernita joined him. "You're carrying this like it's your fault," she said gently. "It's not." "Maybe not," Troy replied, "but I benefited from the system that allowed it. That makes me part of the problem." She squeezed his hand. "Then be part of the solution." Troy wanted to believe her, but sitting there with the weight of the bayou heavy on him He felt older than ever. Tracing the cause. The following morning, the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries arrived with testing gear and a group of biologists who moved through the contaminated stretch of Bayou with methodical precision. Troy went with them, guiding their boats through winding waterways he knew more intimately than the streets of any town. Watching scientists collect samples, photograph evidence, and log data felt unreal to him, as if his home had been transformed into a crime scene under bright scrutiny. Preliminary test results were returned within 48 hours, and they were worse than Troy had imagined. The water contained elevated concentrations of numerous toxins, including industrial chemicals, agricultural pesticides, and heavy metals present at levels lethal to most aquatic life. The contamination did not point to a single origin. Instead, it appeared to be a dangerous mixture formed by multiple pollutants converging into one devastating environmental event. Dr. Sarah Chen, the lead biologist overseeing the investigation, sat down with Troy to explain what they had found. She was younger than his sons, likely in her early 30s, and carried the focused intensity of someone who still believed firmly that science could change outcomes. Troy felt a twinge of envy for that belief, even as he questioned whether the world would allow it to matter. The chemical patterns suggest runoff from at least 3 industrial facilities upstream, she said, spreading out maps and lab reports. We're also detecting pesticide indicators consistent with sugarcane farming. There are petroleum traces too, which could come from multiple sources: spills, boat fuel, or industrial discharge. On their own, none of these may have caused a collapse, but they've been building up for years, and something finally pushed the system over the edge. What kind of something? Troy asked, already suspecting the explanation. Several possibilities, she replied. Heavy rainfall washing pollutants into the water all at once. Temperature swings altering chemical reactions. Oxygen depletion from algae blooms creating dead zones where toxins concentrate. Or it could simply be that the swamp's natural buffering ability has been exceeded. Imagine a sponge soaked completely. One more drop and everything spills out. That image lingered with Troy. The bayou as an overfilled sponge. It reflected everything he had witnessed over the years. The slow decline he had noticed, but chosen not to confront directly. So what happens now? He asked. Dr. Chen's expression tightened. Officially, we continue testing, try to identify specific sources, and work with regulators to see if violations occurred and what actions can be taken. We'll issue safety advisories and monitor whether conditions improve or worsen. And unofficially, Troy pressed. She paused before answering honestly. Unofficially, this will likely move very slowly. Accountability may be limited. Many pollution sources technically operate within their permits, even if the combined impact is disastrous. Companies have legal resources. Agencies are underfunded. And even confirmed violations often result in fines that barely affect profits. Troy appreciated her honesty, even though it confirmed his fears. So nobody pays, he said. Nobody's held accountable for killing hundreds or thousands of animals and wrecking people's livelihoods. I didn't say nobody, Dr. Chen replied carefully. I said the system rarely delivers justice through official means. Sometimes accountability comes through public pressure, media exposure, or community action. Shame can do what regulations can't. He thought about Bernita's words and Jacob's insistence that he use his voice. The show gave him access to viewers far removed from bayous and wetlands, people who rarely considered the environmental cost behind convenience. Maybe making this visible mattered. Maybe linking pollution to real people and real loss carried power. But speaking out meant facing truths he had spent his life avoiding. That the traditional life he defended conflicted with modern industry. That hunting might not be sustainable in a poisoned ecosystem. That the rugged independence he celebrated was tied to systems slowly destroying the land. In the days that followed, Troy began his own search for answers. He contacted environmental groups he had once dismissed, learning many had been documenting Louisiana's wetland destruction for decades. Their warnings had largely gone ignored. He learned the state was losing a football field of coastal wetlands every 100 minutes, a staggering rate fueled by canal dredging, river control, and rising seas. The marshes that once shielded communities and nurtured wildlife were vanishing, taking an entire way of life with them. He discovered that the industrial corridor between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, known as Cancer Alley, contained over 150 petrochemical plants and refineries. Many discharged permitted waste into waters flowing directly into his hunting grounds. Individually regulated, collectively devastating. Records revealed spills and violations barely reported. A plant leaking toxins for months. Farms cited repeatedly for waste mismanagement. Abandoned oil wells left unsealed. Each revelation deepened Troy's anger. The system was not failing. It was operating as designed. He also met people who had fought quietly for years. Activists sued into silence. Scientists punished for inconvenient data. Organizers exhausting themselves against indifference. They were not enemies. They were allies. A conversation with an elderly Houma woman, Diane Dardar, stayed with him. She spoke of losing land, culture, and home as wetlands disappeared. "They don't value what they can't price," she told him. "We're invisible until we threaten profits." Troy recognized himself in her words. Despite fame, his voice had little influence over decisions shaping the swamp's future. His lived knowledge dismissed, his concerns minimized. The realization left him conflicted and heavy. Josephine's death and the poisoned swamp were not accidents, but outcomes of decades of powerful institutional choices. One hunter could not easily confront such systems. Sitting in an untouched stretch of water at sunset, Troy reflected on his deep love for the Bayou and questioned whether love without action was merely complicity. A moment at the breaking point. Troy's growing insomnia and deepening despair mirrored the emotional weight left behind by Josephine's death and the poisoned swamp. Night after night, his mind replayed images of contaminated water and lifeless wildlife, making sleep nearly impossible. The damage he had witnessed refused to release its grip on him, and with every passing day, he felt less capable of maintaining the cheerful, confident persona his television fame demanded. Sitting with Bernita late one evening, he finally admitted what had been eating at him, that he felt like a fraud, smiling for cameras while ignoring truths he should have confronted long ago. Bernita tried to reassure him, reminding him that he hadn't known everything and couldn't be blamed for what had been hidden. Still, Troy struggled with the guilt of recognizing his own willful blindness. The optimism he'd projected for years, magnified through sponsorships, interviews, and public appearances, now felt less like hope and more like betrayal. For the first time, quitting the show crossed his mind, but he quickly realized retreating into silence wouldn't save the swamp or challenge those responsible for poisoning it. His platform, compromised as it felt, might be the only leverage he had left. Bernita reframed the moment as a new kind of battle, one far more difficult than facing alligators, a fight against systems rather than nature itself. Even so, Troy found it hard to reclaim his fighting spirit. Environmental destruction couldn't be wrestled or outmuscled. There were no clear rules, no visible opponent. For the first time in his life, Troy felt truly powerless, and that helplessness began to erode him from within. What Troy was facing was more than grief. It was the realization that a lifetime of tradition had collided with a changing world he could no longer ignore. The swamp had always demanded strength, patience, and respect, but now it was asking something different. As the night settled over the bayou, the questions only grew heavier. Could one man challenge forces built over decades? Could a voice once used for entertainment become a warning instead? The answers were still unclear, but the choice ahead was unavoidable. What Troy decided next would not only shape his future, but the fate of the swamp itself. And that decision was coming closer than he realized.